Hey guys, so we're going to be reading chapter 11 today, and I just want to remind you that this week, so we're reading chapter 11, so 11, 12, and 13 this week. You need to be looking for pieces of evidence that go underneath this overall theme. So anything that stands out to you that shows this overall theme in this chapter, determination and inner strength, help people overcome obstacles. We're looking to add to our web. So we're going to be looking to add evidence in of things we see from this chapter. So if you recall from the last chapter, they had just bombed Funafuti, the island. They landed on this other little island before they went back to their normal base. The entire island gets bombed. And lots of people die. Louis and Phil come out of it unscathed, but their whole crew is broken up. So, because of everything that happened in Superman with the 594 bullet holes. So the last thing that we see is that they get this new crew, and Louis is nervous about it. He says every time they mix up a crew, they have a crack up. So he's nervous about having this new crew, and they mentioned the Green Hornet, which is that plane right there. It's another B-29. They're nervous about it because they have used that plane and pulled parts off of the Green Hornet to put on other planes. So obviously Louis is nervous, and he says that's the craziest plane, and he hopes that he's never be in it again. So this chapter is titled, Nobody is Going to Live Through This. Let's guess what's going to happen in this chapter. Okay. On Thursday, May 27th, 1943, Louis rose at 5 a.m. He pulled on his workout clothes, hiked to the runway, and began his morning mile run. 4 minutes and 12 seconds later, he finished. Remember, Louis is still trying to train to run. And he just ran on the beach in 4 minutes and 12 seconds, and the beach has sand. He was in the best shape, it was a dazzling time given that he was running in sand. He was in the best shape of his life. After breakfast, he climbed onto a car with Phil and Cuppernell and headed to Honolulu for their day off. At the base gate, the despised lieutenant who oversaw their flights flagged them down. A B-24, piloted by a Tennessean named Clarence Corpening, was missing. This is Corpening, right there. So his plane is missing. And remember, when Louis is not bombing, their whole crew does rescue missions. They needed volunteers to hunt for the plane. Phil told them that they had no plane, but the lieutenant said that they could take the Green Hornet. When Phil said that that plane wasn't airworthy, the lieutenant disagreed and said that it had passed inspection. Phil knew that though the word volunteer was being used, that this was an order, so he volunteered. The lieutenant woke pilot Joe Deasy and recruited his crew as well. They'd take the B-24, the Daisy May. Phil, Louis, and Cuppernell turned back to round up their crew. Stopping in his room, Louis wrote in his diary, "There was only one ship, the Green Hornet," he wrote. "We were very reluctant, but Phil finally gave in for the rescue mission." So this is actually Louis's diary entry from that day. And it says, got a call from operations that a B-24 had a forced landing 200 miles south of the island, Palmyra. We were the only crew on base, and there was only one ship, the Green Hornet, a musher. We were reluctant, but he finally gave in for the rescue mission. So he writes in his diary that they're forced to go. Just before he left, Louis hid a note in his footlocker, where he kept his liquor, hidden in mayonnaise jars. "If we're not back in a week," it read, "help yourselves to the booze." Meeting the crew at the Green Hornet, the lieutenant unrolled a map. He believed that Corpening had gone down 200 miles north of Palmyra, an island several hours south of Hawaii. He assigned each crew to a search area. Remember, there's 2 planes that are going to look for this downed plane. Preparing for takeoff, everyone worried about the Green Hornet. Without heavy bombs aboard, Louis told himself, The plane would be able to should be able to stay airborne, but Phil was concerned that the mechanics had removed parts from the plane, and he hoped that nothing critical was missing. The crew reviewed crash procedures and checked survival equipment. There was a provisions box containing food, water, and survival supplies, the responsibility of the new tail gunner, Mac. Louis made sure that the extra life raft was there. He put on his Mae West. Mae West is a life jacket. Phil left his off. At the last moment, a man ran up and asked for a ride to Palmyra. There were no objections, so the man climbed aboard. The Daisy Mae and the Green Hornet flew together towards Palmyra. The Green Hornet could not keep up. After about 200 miles, Phil radioed the Daisy to go on ahead. The planes parted and the crews lost sight of each other. In the mid-afternoon, the Green Hornet reached the search area. Because there was clouds, no one could see the water. So Phil dropped the plane down just under the clouds, just at 800 feet. So 800 feet, if you've ever been in a plane, that's not very high above sea level here. So because of the clouds, he has to drop the plane down. Louis stood just behind Phil and Cuppernell, scanning the ocean. Louis asked if he could switch seats with Phil, taking over. Cuppernell asked if he could switch seats with Phil, taking over as pilot. Cuppernell is the co-pilot. Phil agreed. The enormous Cuppernell squeezed around Phil and into the left seat as Phil moved to the right. A few minutes later, there was a shudder. Louis looked out the window, and engine number 1 on the far left was shaking violently. Then it died. So if you look at this plane, this is the Green Hornet. So on each wing, you've got 2 engines. So 2 here and 2 here. If one engine goes out, it's going to be a problem, but they could keep the plane airborne. But if 2 engines on one side go out, then the whole plane's gonna go down. Okay. So anyway, one of the engine number 1 dies. The bomber tipped left, so it starts dropping this way, and began dropping rapidly towards the ocean. It was a dire emergency. Because the Green Hornet was already very low, Phil and Cuppernell only had seconds to save the plane. They began working rapidly. To minimize the drag from the broken engine, they needed to feather it, turn the propeller blades parallel to the wind to stop the rotation. Normally this was Cuppernell's job, but now he was in the pilot seat. So another issue is the co-pilot and the pilot both have jobs for when an emergency happens, but they're swapped seats, so they both don't know what to do. They needed to feather the engine. Normally this was Cuppernell's job, but he was in the pilot seat. Busy trying to keep the plane airborne, he shouted to the new engineer to come and feather the engine. The new engineer ran forward. There were 4 feathering buttons, 1 for each engine. Leaning between Cuppernell and Phil, the engineer banged on a button. The Green Hornet heaved and lurched left. The engineer had hit the wrong button. So instead of feathering one engine to get one of the engines on one side, he accidentally turns both of them off. So the plane flips on one side. Both left engines were now dead. Phil pushed the 2 working engines full on, trying to keep the plane up long enough to restart the good left engine. The racing right engines rolled the plane halfway onto its side, sending it into a spiral. The engine wouldn't start. The plane kept dropping. The Green Hornet was doomed. Phil grunted 3 words: "Prepare to crash." Louis ran from the flight deck, yelling for everyone to get into crash positions. As the plane whirled, he grabbed an extra life raft. Then he clambered aboard towards his crash position by the right waist window. He saw Mac clutching the provisions box. Other men were frantically pulling on their life jackets, but Mitchell didn't emerge from the nose. As the navigator, it was his duty to gather navigation instruments for the use on the life raft and relay the plane's position to the radioman so he could send a distress signal. but the plane was gyrating down nose first and the escape passage was narrow. Perhaps Mitchell couldn't get out. As the men behind the cockpit fled towards the comparative safety of the rear, so the plane's going down nose down, so they're all running to the back of the plane. One man, almost certainly the engineer who had hit the wrong button, stayed in the front. It was his responsibility to pull the raft release handle behind the cockpit. So this is an issue. So if a plane goes down, the person in the front is supposed to pull this lever and it releases the life rafts when they're close to the water. But if the plane's going nose down, more than likely the person or the people in the front are gonna not make it. So he voluntarily stays up front because he made a mistake, and he pulls the life rafts so that the people can survive. Okay. This meant that he would have no chance to get into a crash position, and thus he had little chance of survival. Phil and Cuppernell fought the plane. The Green Hornet rolled onto its left side, moving faster and faster as the engines thundered. Phil felt strangely fearless. He watched the ocean rotating up at him and thought, "There is nothing more I can do." Louis sat on the floor by the right waist window. There were 5 men near him. No one said anything. Louis looked out the window. All he saw was the cloudy sky turning round and round. Sensing the ocean coming up at the plane, he took a last glance at the twisting sky, then pulled the life raft in front of him and pushed his head into his chest. One terrible tumbling second passed, then another. An instant before the plane struck the water, Louis's mind throbbed with a single final thought. No one is going to live through this. For Louis, there were jagged, soundless sensations. His body catapulted forward, the plane breaking open. Something wrapping itself around him, the cold slap of the water, and then the weight on him. The Green Hornet stabbed into the ocean and blew apart. They didn't just use the word that it fell into the ocean. Think about that. It stabbed into the ocean. So he's using tone words here to tell how violent the crash was. The Green Hornet stabbed into the ocean and blew apart. Louis felt himself being pulled deep underwater. Then abruptly, the downward motion stopped and Louis was flung upward. The fuselage, momentarily buoyed by the air trapped inside, leapt to the surface. Louis opened his mouth and gasped. The air hissed from the plane and water rushed up over Louis again. The plane slipped under and sank towards the ocean floor. Louis tried to orient himself. The tail was no longer behind him. The wings were no longer ahead. The men who had been around him were now gone. The impact had rammed Louis into a machine gun mount and had wedged him under it face down. So he has no idea, like he wakes up from this crash, he has no idea where he is, like what direction is the front of the plane, the back. He just knows that he is stuck under a machine gun. And those mounts for a machine gun are very heavy. Okay. Countless wires were coiled around his body, binding him to the gun mount. He looked at them and thought spaghetti. He thrashed uselessly against them. He felt frantic to breathe. In the cockpit, Phil was fighting to get out. When the plane had hit, he was thrown forward, his head striking something. The wall of water punched through, there's another tone word, punched through the cockpit, and the plane carried him under. From the darkness, he knew that he was far from the surface, sinking deeper by the second. He apparently saw Cuppernell squeeze his big body out of the plane. Phil found what he thought was the cockpit window frame, its glass missing. He pushed himself through and he swam to the surface. So we have a jump. Louis was narrating and now it's Phil. He emerged in a puzzle of debris, his head gushing blood. Remember, he's the pilot, so when the crash happened, he probably was thrown forward. He found a hunk of wreckage and clung to it. It began to sink. There were 2 empty life rafts far away. but Cuppernell was nowhere to be seen. Far below, Louis was writhing in the wires. Remember, those wires are wrapped around him, and he's trapped under the gun mount, wrapped in wires. He saw a body drifting passively. The plane coursed down, and the world fled away above. Darkness enfolded him, and the water pressure bore in with greater and greater intensity. Remember, the farther you go down, the more the water pressure hurts you as you go deeper into the ocean. So he's going deeper down, and the pressure is worse the deeper down he goes. He struggled helplessly and thought, hopeless. Then he had a sudden excruciating bolt of pain in his head. That's what water pressure can do. There was an oncoming stupor as he tore at the wires and clenched at his throat against the need to breathe. With a soft realization that this was the last of his life, he passed out. He woke up in total darkness. He thought, this must be death. But then he felt that the water was still on him, the weight of the plane around him. Unexplainedly, the wires were gone. He was floating inside the fuselage, which was bearing downward. The air was all gone from his lungs, and he was gulping reflexively, swallowing water, fuel, and blood. He was drowning. Louis flung out his arms, trying to find a way out, and his right hand struck something, and his college ring snagged on it. So he's like flailing around, and his arm hit something. He reached towards it with his left hand and felt the smooth length of metal. He was right at the open against the window. Ooh. So he wakes up, he's free from the wires, and he's next to the window. He put his feet on the frame and pushed off, wrenching his right hand free and cutting his finger and scraping the back of his hand on the fuselage. He kicked clear. The plane sank away. Louis yanked the inflation cords on his life jacket. He was suddenly light, the vest pulling him urgently upward. He burst into the dazzling daylight and gasped in a breath and immediately vomited up the salt water and fuel that he had swallowed. He had survived. So if you think about our main theme, determination and inner strength help people overcome obstacles. So his determination to stay alive helped him to survive that plane crash. It helped Phil to survive the plane crash. You saw, even though one of those guys died, he saves the crew because he pulls the lever that lets out the life jacket, or the life rafts. So you've got 3 good examples there of this theme that you could add into your notes. All right, y'all. I will talk to y'all later. Y'all have a good day. See y'all.